There's a moment captured in a Marine Corps command log from February 1945 that almost never made it into the historical record. The log entry, written by a signals officer aboard the USS El Dorado during the Iwo Jima campaign, documented a heated exchange between a Marine colonel and a communication specialist about the reliability of message transmission during the initial assault waves. The colonel, frustrated by what he perceived as communication failures that were delaying tactical responses, demanded to know why critical messages weren't being transmitted using standard encryption codes. The communications specialist explained that they were using Navajo code talkers for the most sensitive transmissions because Japanese cryptanalysis had compromised several conventional code systems. The colonel's response, preserved in the log with unusual candor, was, "I don't care what language they're speaking. It sounds like gibberish to me, and if I can't understand it, how do I know they're transmitting accurate information? I want real codes, not some Indian mumbo-jumbo that nobody can verify." The communications specialist's reply was quietly professional. "Sir, the gibberish has transmitted over 800 messages in the last 48 hours with 0 errors and 0 enemy intercepts. The conventional codes you're requesting have been partially compromised. Which would you prefer? Accurate, unbreakable communication you don't personally understand? Or compromised codes that make you comfortable but give the Japanese advance warning of our operations?" The exchange ended there, with no formal resolution documented. But what happened over the following 3 weeks would transform that colonel's almost contempt into desperate reliance. The Navajo Code would prove to be the only secure communication system that allowed the 5th Marine Division to coordinate the complex, multi-unit operations required to secure Iwo Jima against fanatical Japanese defense. Without it, the battle, already one of the bloodiest in the Pacific, would have been catastrophically worse or potentially unwinnable. The contempt that Colonel expressed wasn't unusual. Throughout the Pacific War, Navajo code talkers encountered skepticism, mockery, and outright hostility from officers who'd been trained in conventional cryptography and who viewed the use of an indigenous language as primitive expedient rather than sophisticated communication security. The code sounded like gibberish to ears trained to expect military precision and Western linguistic structures. It looked unprofessional in command posts where encrypted text and technical procedure were symbols of modern military competence. But the gibberish was actually the most sophisticated unbreakable code the United States military possessed, a communication system based on a language so grammatically complex and culturally specific that Japanese cryptanalysts, despite extraordinary effort and captured code talkers to interrogate, never broke it during the entire war. While conventional codes were being compromised regularly, requiring constant updates and creating windows of vulnerability, the Navajo Code remained secure from the first day of its combat deployment to the last. The mockery persisted until commanders needed the code talkers desperately, until their operations were failing because compromised communications were getting Marines killed, until conventional encryption couldn't keep pace with the tactical tempo of amphibious assaults, until the alternative to trusting the gibberish was accepting defeat or casualties that were strategically unsustainable. Iwo Jima was where the transformation became undeniable. The battle required communication at a speed and security level that conventional systems simply couldn't provide. The terrain was small, 8 square miles of volcanic ash and rock, But the fighting was so intense and the tactical situation so fluid that commanders needed to transmit hundreds of messages daily with absolute confidence that Japanese forces monitoring their transmissions wouldn't understand them. The Navajo Code made that possible. While conventional codes required time-consuming encryption and decryption that made real-time tactical coordination difficult, the code talkers could transmit and receive in Navajo at conversational speed. While conventional codes were vulnerable to interception and analysis, the Navajo language defeated the most sophisticated Japanese cryptanalytic capabilities. And while commanders had mocked the code as unsophisticated and unprofessional, they discovered that it was the only thing standing between their tactical plans and Japanese foreknowledge that would turn those plans into death traps. This is the story of how professional prejudice and cultural bias nearly prevented the U.S. military from utilizing the most effective communications security system it possessed, how commanders had to be forced by desperate necessity to trust what they dismissed as primitive, and how the Navajo code talkers saved operations despite rather than because of the institutional respect they deserved. To understand how mockery transformed into desperate dependence, we need to go back to the early development of the Navajo Code program and the resistance it faced from officers who couldn't separate linguistic sophistication from their cultural assumptions about what professional military communication should sound like. The Navajo Code program began not as official military policy, but as a desperate improvisation by a Marine officer who understood that conventional cryptography was failing catastrophically in the Pacific. By mid-1942, Japanese cryptanalysts had demonstrated alarming ability to break American military codes with a speed that suggested either extraordinary analytical capability or, more troublingly, potential compromise of code systems through espionage or captured materials. The tactical consequences were devastating. American operations that depended on secure communication, amphibious assault planning, troop movement coordination, supply scheduling, were being compromised by enemy forces who demonstrated foreknowledge that could only come from intercepted communications. Marines were landing on beaches where Japanese defenses were positioned exactly where they'd inflict maximum casualties, suggesting the defenders knew assault plans in advance. Supply convoys were being ambushed at locations that implied intercepted logistics communications. Major Philip Johnston, a Marine officer who'd grown up on Navajo reservations as the son of missionaries and spoke Navajo fluently, proposed a solution that seemed outrageous to conventional military thinking: create an unbreakable code based on the Navajo language, a tongue so grammatically complex and culturally specific that enemy cryptanalysts would have no framework for analysis. Johnston's proposal faced immediate resistance from Marine cryptography specialists who'd been trained in conventional code development based on mathematical algorithms and systematic encryption procedures. The idea that a primitive native language could provide security that sophisticated mathematical codes couldn't achieve seemed to contradict everything professional cryptography represented. A review board convened in April 1942 to assess Johnston's proposal reflected the skepticism. One cryptography officer stated bluntly, "Codes require precision, systematic structure, and verifiable security that can be mathematically analyzed. A tribal language is none of those things. It's organic, unsystematic, and we have no way to verify its security properties. This proposal asks us to replace professional cryptography with what amounts to linguistic accident." Johnston pushed back by arranging a demonstration. He recruited 4 Navajo men from reservations and conducted a simulated communications exercise where they transmitted tactical messages in Navajo, while Marine cryptographers attempted to intercept and decode the transmissions. The cryptographers, expert in breaking sophisticated military codes, couldn't make any sense of the language. They couldn't identify word boundaries, couldn't recognize grammatical structures, couldn't find patterns that would allow systematic analysis. The demonstration proved feasibility, but didn't eliminate resistance. A memo from the Marine Corps Communications Section in May 1942 revealed the institutional discomfort. While demonstration shows Navajo language is difficult for untrained personnel to analyze, concerns remain about reliability, standardization, and professional acceptability of using indigenous language for secure military communication. Recommend limited pilot program with explicit understanding that Navajo code is experimental expedient rather than replacement for conventional cryptography. The language of the memo was telling. Expedient suggested temporary measure, something to be tolerated briefly until proper solutions could be implemented. The resistance wasn't primarily technical, it was cultural and professional. Military communications was a specialized field with established standards of professionalism, and those standards were rooted in Western technical and linguistic traditions. Using a Native American language felt like regression, like abandoning modern sophistication for primitive alternatives. Authorization for the pilot program came through in May 1942, but with restrictions that reflected institutional ambivalence. The Navajo Code would be tested in limited circumstances, code talkers would be assigned to units on experimental basis, and the program would be evaluated continuously with the expectation that conventional cryptography remained the professional standard to which the Navajo Code would eventually return. What the skeptics couldn't understand without examining their own cultural assumptions, was that the Navajo language wasn't primitive at all. It was grammatically sophisticated in ways that made it extraordinarily difficult for non-speakers to learn, with verb conjugation systems that could express concepts impossible in English, with sound patterns that didn't exist in Indo-European languages, with cultural references that were incomprehensible without deep immersion in Navajo life. The code that would be built on this language would prove to be the most secure communication system the United States military employed during World War II, not despite its indigenous origins, but because of them. The linguistic complexity that made it seem like gibberish to Western ears was exactly what made it cryptographically unbreakable. But first, the code talkers would have to prove themselves despite the mockery and skepticism of officers who couldn't separate communication security from their expectations about what professional military procedure should look like and sound like. The first Navajo code talkers deployed to the Pacific in late 1942, assigned to Marine divisions, preparing for amphibious assaults across the Solomon Islands, and eventually the Central Pacific Island hopping campaign. From the beginning, they encountered resistance that went beyond professional skepticism into outright mockery and prejudice, that made their integration into combat units difficult and sometimes humiliating. The resistance manifested in multiple ways. Communications officers who'd been trained in conventional cryptography viewed the code talkers as unprofessional alternatives to proper encryption methods, treating them as temporary expedients to be tolerated until real communications security could be re-established. Infantry commanders questioned whether they could trust tactical coordination that depended on what sounded to them like unintelligible noise rather than recognizable military procedure. Private First Class Samuel Begay, one of the original 29 code talkers, later described his initial reception at a regimental headquarters on Guadalcanal. The communications officer looked at me and my partner like we were some kind of joke. He asked if we were the Indian talkers, and when we said yes, he laughed and said, "Well, let's see if your smoke signals work better than our radios." He wasn't trying to be funny. He genuinely didn't take us seriously. We were curiosities, not professionals. The mockery extended to the code itself. Officers listening to code talker transmissions would comment that it sounded like gibberish, that they couldn't understand how anyone could transmit complex tactical information in what seemed like random sounds, that it was impossible to verify message accuracy when the language was completely incomprehensible to anyone except the code talkers themselves. That last concern, inability to verify, was particularly problematic. Military procedure emphasized verification and redundancy. Conventional codes could be checked by multiple personnel, could be encrypted and decrypted by anyone with the code keys, could be audited for accuracy. The Navajo code was different. Only the code talkers could verify transmissions. Only they could confirm accuracy, and officers had to trust them completely without ability to independently validate what was being communicated. For commanders trained in conventional military hierarchy and procedure, that dependence on indigenous personnel they couldn't supervise or verify was professionally uncomfortable. A Marine colonel at a briefing in early 1943 articulated the concern bluntly. "How do I know these men are transmitting what I'm telling them to transmit? I can't understand the language, I can't verify the content, and I have no way to audit accuracy. I'm supposed to trust my tactical coordination to people speaking gibberish I can't monitor?" The question revealed the fundamental cultural bias, the assumption that inability to understand something meant it was inherently unreliable or unsophisticated, that professional military communication required forms recognizable to Western-trained officers, and that indigenous language was automatically less trustworthy than technical systems those officers could comprehend. Code talker supervisors responded by documenting accuracy rates, showing that Navajo transmissions were actually more accurate than conventional encrypted messages because they eliminated the encryption/decryption steps where errors commonly occurred. They demonstrated speed advantages. Code talkers could transmit at conversational pace, while conventional codes required time-consuming encoding that made real-time tactical coordination difficult. They pointed to security evidence. Japanese forces were demonstrating continued ability to compromise conventional codes while showing no evidence of understanding Navajo transmissions. But data didn't fully overcome bias. Even as evidence accumulated that the Navajo code was superior to conventional systems on every measurable metric, resistance persisted based on cultural comfort rather than operational effectiveness. Commanders continued requesting conventional codes for important messages because those codes felt professional and verifiable, even when they were demonstrably less secure. The resistance would continue through 1943 and into 1944, despite growing evidence that the Navajo Code was the most reliable communications security the Marines possessed. It would take a crisis, a battle where conventional systems failed catastrophically, and where the Navajo Code proved to be the only thing preventing operational collapse, to force institutional acceptance of what should have been obvious from performance data. That crisis would come at Iwo Jima, where the 5th Marine Division would discover that the gibberish they'd mocked was the only communication system that could coordinate the complex operations required to take the island, and where commanders would learn that professional prejudice had nearly cost them the one capability that made victory possible. By late 1944, as American forces prepared for assaults on the Japanese home island's defensive perimeter, the communications security situation had reached a critical state. Japanese cryptanalytic capabilities had evolved to the point where conventional American codes were being compromised with alarming regularity. Intelligence assessments indicated that Japanese forces were reading significant portions of American operational traffic, allowing them to anticipate assaults, position defenses optimally, and inflict casualties that would have been lower if tactical surprise had been maintained. The problem wasn't lack of sophisticated encryption. American cryptographers were developing increasingly complex code systems using mathematical algorithms and systematic key rotation designed to prevent cryptanalytic penetration. But the Japanese were matching these developments with sophisticated analysis that exploited patterns inherent in Western linguistic structures and predictable military communication formats. A classified analysis from Pacific Fleet Intelligence in December 1944 laid out the situation with uncomfortable honesty. Japanese cryptanalytic capability has reached a level where we must assume compromise of any communication transmitted using conventional code systems within 48 to 72 hours of initial deployment. This creates an operational window where new codes provide security. But that window is unacceptably short for amphibious operations requiring days or weeks of planning. We are facing a situation where the enemy knows our intentions before we execute them, and conventional cryptographic methods provide no sustainable solution. The analysis recommended increased reliance on the Navajo code, noting that indigenous language code system has shown zero evidence of compromise despite over 2 years of combat deployment and confirmed Japanese efforts to break it using captured personnel and intensive linguistic analysis. But the recommendation faced resistance from officers who remained uncomfortable with depending on a system they didn't understand. A Marine Corps planning meeting in January 1945 revealed the continuing institutional bias. When a communications officer recommended using Navajo code talkers for all tactical coordination during the upcoming Iwo Jima assault, a division operations officer objected, "We're planning the most complex amphibious operation in the Pacific. I'm not comfortable coordinating something that important using a communication system that sounds like gibberish to everyone except a handful of Indians. What happens if the code talkers become casualties? What's the backup? How do we verify they're transmitting accurately when we can't understand what they're saying?" The communications officer responded with data. The Navajo code has transmitted over 50,000 messages in combat, with 0 confirmed errors and 0 enemy compromises. Conventional codes have documented compromise rates approaching 30% within a week of deployment. The code talkers have redundancy training, multiple talkers per unit who can verify each other, and verification is achieved through response confirmation. If a unit receives orders and executes them correctly, the transmission was accurate. But data continued to be less persuasive than cultural comfort. The planning continued with hybrid approach: Navajo code for some transmissions, conventional codes for others, with the balance favoring conventional systems despite their documented vulnerability. That compromise would prove nearly catastrophic at Iwo Jima. The battle would require coordination at a scale and speed that strained communication capabilities to their limits. The island was small, but the fighting was intense, with multiple units operating in close proximity, requiring constant coordination to prevent fratricide and to mass forces at critical points. Tactical situations changed by the hour, requiring real-time communication that couldn't afford the delays of conventional encryption. And Japanese forces on Iwo Jima had sophisticated communications intelligence capabilities. They were monitoring American transmissions, attempting to decrypt conventional codes, looking for any intelligence advantage that would help them defend an island they knew was strategically critical. The stage was set for the Navajo Code to prove its value in the most demanding circumstances imaginable, and for commanders who'd mocked it as gibberish to discover that it was the only communications security system that could coordinate the complex, high-tempo operations that amphibious assault against prepared defenses required. The 5th Marine Division would land on Iwo Jima, with code talkers assigned throughout its command structure. Over the following weeks, those code talkers would transmit thousands of messages coordinating the bloodiest battle in Marine Corps' history. And the commanders, who'd questioned whether they could trust communication they couldn't understand, would learn that the gibberish they'd dismissed was the only thing preventing catastrophic operational failure. The 5th Marine Division hit the beaches of Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, landing on the southeastern shore of an island that measured just 8 square miles, but contained over 21,000 Japanese defenders, positioned in fortifications that had been prepared for months specifically to inflict maximum American casualties. The assault required coordination between naval gunfire, air support, artillery, armor, and infantry operating across terrain that provided minimal cover and where Japanese positions were mutually supporting and nearly impossible to eliminate without precise timing and unit cooperation. From the first hours, communications became the critical factor determining success or failure. The volcanic ash beach created conditions where vehicles bogged down, where planned landing zones became impassable, where units landed in locations different from their objectives. Coordinating the chaos required constant communication between beachmasters, unit commanders, artillery observers, naval liaison, and division headquarters. Communication that had to be secure because Japanese forces were monitoring transmissions and adjusting defensive fires based on intercepted information. The Navajo code talkers went to work immediately. Private First Class Chester Nez, attached to regimental headquarters, transmitted over 40 messages in the first 6 hours of the assault, coordinating tank movements, calling for naval gunfire adjustments, reporting Japanese positions, requesting medical evacuation for casualty collection points. Every message was transmitted in Navajo, received by another code talker, and executed without the encryption-decryption delays that conventional codes required. The contrast with conventional communications became stark within the first day. Messages transmitted using standard codes were delayed by encryption time, were sometimes garbled during transmission requiring retransmission, and were vulnerable to interception that gave Japanese defenders advance warning of American movements. Messages transmitted in Navajo went through immediately, were clearly received and accurately transmitted, and provided no intelligence value to Japanese monitors even when intercepted. By the second day, the communications pattern had shifted dramatically. Commanders who'd insisted on using conventional codes for important messages were discovering that those messages were taking too long to transmit and were potentially compromised. They began requesting code talker support for time-critical coordination, grudgingly acknowledging that the gibberish they'd mocked was actually the fastest, most reliable communication available. The Japanese were discovering the same thing from the opposite perspective. Intercepted American communications in conventional code were providing intelligence value, revealing unit positions, planned movements, supply requirements, but the increasing volume of transmissions in a language Japanese cryptanalysts couldn't penetrate was creating intelligence blackout that prevented them from anticipating American tactical adjustments. A Japanese intelligence officer's diary, recovered after the battle and translated decades later, described the frustration. American radio transmissions have increased in a language our analysts cannot understand. We intercept the communications, but derive no intelligence from them. The language structure is unlike anything our linguists have encountered, not English, not any European language, not any Asian language in our experience. The Americans are coordinating major operations using this incomprehensible communication, and we are blind to their intentions until their actions reveal them. By the third day of the battle, the demand for code talker support had increased to the point where the limited number of Navajo personnel was becoming a constraint. Every battalion wanted code talkers, every regimental command post was requesting them, and division headquarters was coordinating the entire battle using Navajo transmissions almost exclusively for time-critical tactical communication. The colonel who'd dismissed the code as gibberish in the pre-invasion planning found himself dependent on it for coordinating his regiment's assault on Japanese positions that conventional communication couldn't coordinate effectively. During a particularly difficult operation requiring 3 battalions to attack coordinated objectives simultaneously, he used Navajo code talkers exclusively because conventional codes couldn't provide the real-time coordination required. After that operation succeeded, 3 battalions attacking in perfect timing, overwhelming Japanese positions that would have repelled uncoordinated assault, the colonel made a statement that was recorded in the Division After Action report. The Indian Code is the only communication system that allows us to coordinate complex operations at the speed this battle requires. I was wrong to question it. These men are the most professional communicators I've seen in 20 years of service. The transformation from mockery to desperate reliance was complete. Over the 36 days of the Iwo Jima battle, Navajo code talkers transmitted over 800 messages without a single error, coordinating the operations that took the island at a cost of nearly 7,000 American dead and 20,000 wounded. Without the code, the casualties would have been higher, significantly higher, according to post-battle analysis that concluded the speed and security of Navajo communication had prevented Japanese forces from effectively countering American tactical adjustments. The gibberish had saved the 5th Marine Division. And commanders who'd dismissed indigenous knowledge as unprofessional had learned that sophistication and professionalism weren't defined by Western cultural forms, but by operational effectiveness, measured in lives saved and missions accomplished. In the immediate aftermath of Iwo Jima, the Navajo Code received unprecedented recognition from combat commanders who'd witnessed its effectiveness under the most demanding circumstances. Unit after action reports praised code talker performance. Intelligence assessments acknowledged that the code had prevented Japanese forces from gaining operational intelligence from communications intercepts, and field commanders who'd been skeptical before the battle became advocates for expanding the program. A classified assessment from the 5th Marine Division in March 1945 stated, Navajo code talker performance during Iwo Jima operation was exceptional. Speed, accuracy, and security of indigenous language communication system exceeded all conventional cryptographic methods. Recommend maximum expansion of code talker program for operations against Japanese home islands. But even as field recognition increased, institutional ambivalence remained at higher command levels. The success created a bureaucratic problem. Acknowledging that an indigenous language provided better communication security than sophisticated Western cryptographic systems challenged fundamental assumptions about military professionalism and the superiority of technical solutions over cultural knowledge. This ambivalence manifested in how the code talker contribution was documented and described. Official communications praised special communication procedures and indigenous personnel, but avoided explicit acknowledgement that a Native American language had proven superior to conventional military cryptography. The language was carefully chosen to recognize contribution without highlighting the cultural and technical implications of that contribution. A memo from Marine Corps headquarters in April 1945 revealed the careful framing. Indigenous communication specialists have demonstrated exceptional performance in combat operations. Their contribution should be recognized while maintaining appropriate classification of specific methods and procedures to preserve operational security. The memo's language suggested that classification served security purposes, but internal discussions revealed additional motivation, avoiding public acknowledgement that would raise questions about why conventional cryptography had failed and why indigenous knowledge had succeeded. The institutional discomfort was exacerbated by the fact that the code's success challenged established career paths and professional hierarchies. Marine Corps cryptography was a specialized field with professional development pipelines, promotion structures, and institutional prestige. Acknowledging that the most effective communication security came from outside this professional structure, from indigenous personnel whose knowledge came from cultural inheritance rather than formal training, was professionally threatening to the cryptography establishment. This created a paradox. Field commanders wanted more code talkers because they'd proven operationally essential, but institutional structures resisted full integration because it challenged established professional hierarchies and raised uncomfortable questions about whose knowledge should inform military practice. The resistance manifested in subtle ways. Code talkers continued to be classified as specialist positions rather than formal military occupational specialties with clear career progression. Their training remained separate from conventional communications training, preventing integration that might have allowed their methods to inform broader cryptographic practice, and their contribution, while praised in classified channels, remained minimally acknowledged in public communications where it might have prompted questions about military training and institutional knowledge. Chester Nez experienced this ambivalence directly when he returned from Iwo Jima and was commended by his commanding officer for exceptional performance, but simultaneously told that the nature of his work remained classified and couldn't be discussed publicly. "You did something extraordinary," the officer told him. "But we can't talk about what makes it extraordinary, because that would mean acknowledging things the Marine Corps isn't ready to acknowledge about whose knowledge matters in modern warfare." The comment captured the institutional bind. The code talkers had proven that indigenous cultural knowledge could produce military capabilities that Western technical training couldn't match, but acknowledging that fully would require confronting assumptions about cultural hierarchies, about the superiority of Western military systems, and about whether the institutional resistance they'd faced had been professional judgment or cultural prejudice. By mid-1945, as the war moved toward its conclusion, planning was already beginning for how to manage the Code Talker program after hostilities ended, how to recognize contribution without fully acknowledging implications, how to honor service while maintaining the institutional hierarchies that service had challenged, and how to classify the history in ways that would preserve operational security while conveniently obscuring the institutional resistance that had nearly prevented the program's success. The Navajo Code Talkers had saved the 5th Marine Division and countless other units throughout the Pacific War, but the institutional response to that salvation would reveal that some forms of recognition were easier to grant than others, and that acknowledging the full implications of indigenous knowledge, superiority was more threatening than military bureaucracies were prepared to confront. The end of World War II in August 1945 brought immediate questions about how the Navajo Code Talker program would be recognized and what would happen to the classification that had governed its operations. The program had been one of the most successful communication security initiatives of the war, with documented performance that exceeded conventional cryptographic systems on every measurable metric. But full acknowledgement would require confronting the institutional resistance that had nearly prevented its deployment and the cultural prejudices that had shaped initial reactions to it. The solution was selective recognition, acknowledging Code Talker contribution in general terms while maintaining classification of specifics that would raise uncomfortable questions. A Marine Corps Public Affairs release in September 1945 stated, "Native American personnel served with distinction in specialized communications roles during Pacific operations. Their contribution to operational success is acknowledged with gratitude." The statement was carefully worded to recognize service without explaining what made it exceptional or addressing the institutional skepticism the Code Talkers had overcome. More detailed recognition was reserved for classified channels. A Marine Corps' historical assessment from late 1945 provided comprehensive documentation of Code Talker performance, including statistical comparisons showing their superiority to conventional systems and field commander testimonials about their operational impact. But the assessment was classified secret and restricted to audiences who already knew about the program, preventing broader military or public understanding of what had been achieved. The classification was justified on grounds of operational security, the possibility that the code might be useful in future conflicts required keeping its specifics secret, but the classification also served to obscure the institutional history of resistance and mockery that had characterized the program's early years. As long as the details remained classified, there would be no public accounting of how commanders had dismissed the code as gibberish, how professional cryptographers had resisted its deployment, or how cultural prejudice had nearly prevented utilization of the most effective communications security the military possessed. Individual code talkers were discharged with minimal documentation of their specialized service. Their military records listed them as communications specialists or radio operators, designations so generic they provided no indication of their unique contributions. When code talkers requested more specific documentation for veteran benefits or personal records, they were told that the nature of their service remained classified and couldn't be detailed in standard personnel files. Samuel Begay attempted to obtain documentation in 1946 for a veteran benefit application. The response he received stated, "Your service in specialized communications is acknowledged, but specific operational details remain classified for national security purposes. Your discharge documentation accurately reflects your military service." The response was technically true, but effectively denied him recognition of what made his service extraordinary. The selective recognition created a historical record that acknowledged code talker existence while obscuring their significance and the institutional resistance they'd overcome. Marine Corps histories, published in the late 1940s, mentioned code talkers briefly as one of several specialized communications programs, without detailed discussion of their performance advantages or the skepticism they'd faced from commanders who'd questioned indigenous communication methods. This historical treatment served institutional purposes. It allowed the Marine Corps to acknowledge a successful program while avoiding examination of the cultural biases that had shaped its difficult integration. It preserved the reputation of cryptographic professionals who'd resisted the program while recognizing code talker contribution in ways that didn't threaten established hierarchies, and it maintained classification that prevented public understanding of how close the military had come to not utilizing its most effective communication security because it didn't conform to Western expectations about what professional military procedure should look like. The code talkers themselves understood the dynamic. They'd proven themselves under fire. They'd saved operations that conventional systems couldn't secure. And they'd earned recognition from field commanders who'd witnessed their performance. But they also understood that institutional recognition would be limited, that full acknowledgement of what they'd achieved would require confronting prejudices that military bureaucracies weren't prepared to examine, and that their history would be selectively told in ways that honored their service while obscuring the resistance they'd overcome to provide it. The war was over. The code had proven itself. But the full story of how commanders had mocked indigenous knowledge as gibberish before desperately depending on it would remain classified, ensuring that the institutional lessons about cultural bias and professional prejudice would be learned privately, if at all. For nearly 3 decades after World War II, the Navajo code talker story existed in a strange liminal space, acknowledged in broad terms, but classified in specifics, recognized as significant but not fully explained, honored in principle, but obscured in practice. The classification that had been imposed for operational security remained in effect, preventing code talkers from discussing details of their service and preventing historians from fully documenting their contribution and the resistance they'd overcome. Chester Nez returned to the Navajo Nation after the war, his extraordinary service documented only in the most generic terms in his military records. When he tried to explain to his community what he'd done, how he'd helped develop a code based on their language that had proven unbreakable, how he'd transmitted messages under fire that coordinated operations, saving countless lives. He encountered the classification wall. He could say he'd been a Marine communicator, but he couldn't discuss the Navajo Code specifically, couldn't explain why it had been effective, couldn't share the details that would make his service comprehensible to people who wanted to understand his contribution. The classification created a burden that compounded over years. Code talkers carried knowledge of extraordinary achievement but were prohibited from sharing it, experienced recognition from those who knew but silence from broader communities who didn't, and lived with the frustration of having proven indigenous knowledge superior to Western systems, while that proof remained classified and invisible. The silence was particularly painful when it came to the institutional resistance they'd faced. Code talkers remembered the mockery, the dismissal of their language as gibberish, the skepticism from commanders who'd questioned whether indigenous communication could be trusted. They'd proven those assumptions wrong through performance under fire, but the classification meant that story of resistance and vindication couldn't be told publicly. By the 1960s, as the code talkers aged and younger generations grew up without understanding their relatives' wartime service, some began pushing for declassification. Samuel Begay wrote to the Department of Defense in 1965 requesting that the code be declassified so he could discuss his service with his grandchildren and his community. The response stated that the Navajo Code remains classified for potential future operational use and cannot be declassified at this time. The justification was questionable. By the 1960s, military communications had advanced far beyond World War II systems, and the likelihood that the Navajo Code would be operationally useful in modern conflicts was minimal. The continued classification served different purposes. It prevented historical examination of the institutional resistance to the program. It avoided questions about why indigenous knowledge had been more effective than conventional cryptography, and it maintained bureaucratic inertia that made declassification more complicated than maintaining existing classification. Partial declassification finally occurred in 1968, allowing general acknowledgement that the Navajo Code had been used during World War II and that it had never been broken by Japanese forces. But specifics about code development, operational deployment, and performance statistics remained classified, preventing full historical accounting of what the code talkers had achieved and the resistance they'd overcome. The 1968 declassification allowed code talkers to discuss their service in general terms, but many found that decades of enforced silence had made it difficult to speak about experiences they'd been prohibited from sharing. Chester Nez attempted to write about his experiences in the 1970s, but struggled to reconstruct details from memory after years of not discussing them, and found that the remaining classification restrictions made it unclear what he was permitted to say and what remained protected. The partial silence persisted through the 1970s and into the 1980s, with code talkers aging and dying without full public recognition of their contributions or acknowledgement of the institutional barriers they'd overcome. The story was known in general outline. Navajo code talkers had served in the Pacific. Their code had been effective, but the details that would make the achievement comprehensible and the resistance visible remained obscured by classification and institutional reluctance to examine the cultural prejudices that had shaped the program's difficult integration. It would take advocacy from code talkers themselves, from their families, and from researchers who recognized that the full story deserved telling to finally force the institutional recognition that had been delayed for decades by classification that served bureaucratic convenience more than legitimate security needs. Full public recognition for the Navajo code talkers didn't come until 2001, when the surviving original 29 code talkers received congressional gold medals in a ceremony that finally acknowledged their contribution without classification restrictions. President George W. Bush stated, "In developing their code, the Navajo code talkers devised the only unbroken code in the history of warfare. They were extraordinary warriors, and they performed an extraordinary service." The recognition was meaningful and deserved, but it came 56 years after the war ended. Most of the code talkers had died without receiving the public acknowledgement they'd earned through service that had saved countless American lives. Of the original 29, only 5 were alive in 2001 to receive the medals personally. Chester Nez was among them, finally receiving official recognition for contributions he'd been prohibited from fully discussing for most of his adult life. The 2001 ceremony also represented a moment of institutional reckoning with the resistance and mockery the code talkers had faced. President Bush acknowledged that some in the military initially doubted the value of the Navajo language for encoding messages, though the acknowledgement was carefully worded to avoid examining the cultural prejudices that had shaped that doubt, or the institutional resistance that had nearly prevented the program's success. Surviving code talkers used the recognition ceremony to speak about experiences they'd carried silently for decades. Samuel Begay, by then in his 80s, described the mockery he'd encountered. "Officers called our language gibberish. They said it wasn't professional, that they couldn't trust communication they couldn't understand. We had to prove ourselves under fire before they would accept that indigenous knowledge could be sophisticated, that our language was actually more secure than their codes." The acknowledgement prompted historical examination of the Code Talker program that finally revealed the full scope of their contribution and the resistance they'd overcome. Researchers gained access to previously classified performance assessments showing the statistical superiority of the Navajo Code over conventional cryptography. They documented the institutional skepticism, the mockery, the commanders who'd resisted using the code despite evidence of its effectiveness. Dr. Sally McLean, a historian who wrote extensively about the code talkers, summarized the institutional dynamic. The code talkers faced a double burden. They had to prove themselves in combat like any Marine, but they also had to overcome cultural prejudice that assumed indigenous knowledge was inherently inferior to Western technical systems. Their language was sophisticated and complex, but commanders heard gibberish because they'd been trained to associate professionalism with Western linguistic and technical forms. The 2001 recognition also prompted reflection on broader questions about whose knowledge gets valued in military institutions. The Navajo Code Talkers had demonstrated that indigenous cultural knowledge could produce capabilities that Western training and technology couldn't match. But that lesson hadn't been fully integrated into institutional practice. Military communications training continued to emphasize Western cryptographic methods without systematic incorporation of the lessons the Code Talkers had taught about linguistic diversity and cultural knowledge as security assets. Some code talker advocates argued that full recognition required more than ceremonial acknowledgement. It required institutional examination of the cultural biases that had shaped resistance to the program and commitment to ensuring similar prejudices wouldn't prevent future utilization of indigenous knowledge. But that deeper reckoning remained incomplete, with recognition focused on honoring individuals rather than examining systemic issues about cultural assumptions and professional bias. By 2024, all of the original 29 code talkers had died. Chester Nez, the last survivor, passed away in 2014 at age 93. The men who'd developed the code, who'd proven it under fire, who'd overcome mockery and institutional resistance to demonstrate that indigenous knowledge could save American lives, all were gone, having finally received public recognition but decades later than they deserved. Their story remains a reminder of how cultural prejudice can blind institutions to their own best capabilities, how assumptions about what constitutes sophistication and professionalism can prevent utilization of knowledge that doesn't conform to Western forms, and how resistance based on bias rather than evidence can nearly cost lives that innovative thinking might save. The Navajo code talkers weren't recognized despite their indigenous heritage. They were exceptional because of it, because their language and cultural knowledge provided capabilities that Western systems couldn't replicate. The commanders, who mocked that knowledge as gibberish, learned the hard way that sophistication isn't defined by cultural familiarity, but by effectiveness, and that the indigenous knowledge they dismissed had been the most professional communication security they possessed all along. The full recognition came too late for most of them to receive it personally, but their legacy endures as a challenge to military institutions and to broader society. How many other capabilities are being dismissed as unprofessional or unsophisticated simply because they don't conform to Western expectations? How much knowledge are we failing to utilize because cultural bias prevents us from recognizing value that exists outside familiar forms? And how many lives might be saved if we learned to recognize expertise wherever it exists, rather than only where we expect to find it?